Thank you very much. It's a privilege to join you, and also a great privilege to follow Michael Clemens, whose talk I very much enjoyed. Um, I'm going to speak about the wealth of refugees, how displaced people can build economies. Under what conditions can we enable and empower refugees to be economic contributors to the societies they're part of, but also potentially be placed in a position where they can support themselves, their families, and their communities. And as was mentioned, I'm going to draw upon research that was part of my forthcoming book with Oxford University Press, The Wealth of Refugees. Um, that builds on a decade of research as part of the Refugee Economies Programme. With brilliant colleagues of mine at the University of Oxford and across East Africa. And the broader research is available on our website, and the link for that is illustrated in the slide. Um, the Refugee Economies Programme and the work in the book really try to explore the economic lives of refugees and their impact on host communities from a very interdisciplinary perspective. It's very much focused, to draw on Michael Clemens' analogy, on the potatoes, on the empirical observations, rather than large scale modeling with large amounts of assumptions. And with that in mind, this isn't work that's just a work of economics, it's in a way a political economy approach, integrating different disciplines, integrating economics, political science, and also economic anthropology and economic sociology. The book, for instance, tries to ask four broad sets of questions in relation to the economic lives of refugees. First, the ethics, what's right. Secondly, the economics, what works. Thirdly, the politics, what persuades. And fourthly, the policy, what's next. And I think one of the things that's specific about this work is we're focused very much on, for want of a better term, the global south, where the majority of the world's refugees are hosted. Um, and that's not to say it's of any less importance to focus on the rich world, but our focus is very much on the global south. And when we think very often about refugees, the common media images are at the fault lines between South and North, the movement of people across the Mediterranean, at the US Mexican border. And these are very important images to have in the media. They highlight the global nature of refugee migration. They illustrate very starkly for public audiences the manifest failures of the policy frameworks that rich countries adopt in trying to exclude people. But it's also important to get a sense of perspective, geographical and quantitative perspective, about the nature of the refugee and displacement challenge. Indeed, when we think about numbers, we have the annual headline figures produced by the UN Refugee Agency that tell us that we have more refugees and displaced people than at any time since the Second World War. Over 70 million people are displaced, of whom about 26 million are refugees. But that's still only about 0.35% of the world's population who are refugees, a number that should be manageable. The real challenge comes from the geographical concentration of refugees. 85% at least are in low and middle income countries, and they're not equally distributed across those countries. They're concentrated in a small number. So just 10 host countries host the overwhelming majority of the world's refugees. And that's why in most of my research, I try to focus on these countries where most refugees are. In order to get some balance and perspective in how we look at where the challenges are, but where we also need to focus a significant part of the policy solutions we look for. And in those regions of the world, there are a whole range of approaches that international organizations, donor governments, NGOs, and other actors take. But the default playbook, if you like, the framework we adopt as a response, basically has three approaches, all in their own way, limited, unsustainable for refugees, for host communities, and the wider international community. Um, a huge proportion of refugees in certain regions of the world, such as Africa, continue to be hosted in refugee camps, where they often are denied the right to work, freedom of movement, and have particular restrictions on their socioeconomic rights as well as other rights. On a global scale, now the majority of the world's refugees are in cities, particularly large urban cities, urban metropolises, but also secondary cities. And in many contexts, refugees are forced to forego assistance, may not be given access to the formal right to work in urban areas, and so often rely upon their own networks and the informal economy. And the final route that understandably many refugees are forced to avail themselves is seeking illicit routes to access asylum procedures in the rich world by resorting to boats or other smuggling networks. But that still represents a tiny minority of the solutions and responses and strategies of displaced people around the world. I think what highlights the really stark tragedy and unsustainability of the default refugee camp model that we've had for so many years is this example, the Ali Ade refugee camp in Djibouti, a little known camp that hosts and has hosted consistently only around 10,000 refugees, mainly from Somalia and Somaliland and some from Ethiopia. And when I was there about a decade ago now, um, a refugee from Somaliland called Wuli, who has been there since 1988, told me about the decades he had spent in that camp, denied the right to work, denied the ability to further his education. And what Woolley had done was set up informal education in a camp that at that time didn't have its own secondary school, providing access to English language training and maths in a tent with a piece of chalk and a blackboard. And he said to me, man does not live on hope alone. Um, Man does not live on food and water alone, but on hope. My hope is gone, but I pass it to the next generation. And that to me illustrated um, the real set of challenges, not only for those people, but the loss of talent, skills, aspirations, when we effectively warehouse so many people in such a stark context. And so since then, what I've tried to do is embark on research that can provide an evidence-based understanding of how we can reimagine responses in those parts of the world to be more sustainable for refugees, for host communities, and potentially for the wider world. And so in the Refugee Economies Programme, we look in particular at the economic lives of refugees in 3 host countries in East Africa: Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. And I suppose the immediate response might be, well, isn't this a little bit obscure from a European or North American perspective? Well, the number of refugees hosted in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda at the start of our research was larger than the total number of refugees hosted by 28 countries within the European Union. The numbers, somewhat north of 2.5 million at the moment in that region, are a significant proportion of the world's refugees. And that's a consequence of these countries being proximate to and neighboring countries that have been subject to crisis and conflict for a very long period of time. What's been unique about our study is that we use both quantitative and qualitative data, recognizing many of the challenges that Michael Clemens has highlighted. We try to ensure that even when we identify patterns within the quantitative data that we collect ourselves, that we triangulate that and look for causal relationships through in-depth qualitative research. But what we've tried to do is build one of the first panel data sets across countries focusing on the economic lives of refugees, covering not only one refugee camp or settlement or group of camps in each of those countries, but also urban areas, in this case, the capital cities. What we've done in our data collection is cover both refugee communities and proximate host communities. And what we've also aspired to do is follow the same refugees over time to see what we can learn about their economic lives and what improves their outcomes. The starting point for this is really to say, well, the image we often have of refugee camps looks a bit like this. This is the Kakuma refugee camp in northwest Kenya, home to around 180,000 refugees from South Sudan, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi. And it is, in many ways, a stark environment: arid, remote, lack of infrastructure, lack of access to water and electricity, denied the right to work by government legislation, at least on a formal level. But when you scratch below the surface, actually this is closer to what a lot of life in Kakuma looks like. Informal businesses along streets with huge markets, buying, selling, producing, consuming, borrowing, lending, the whole framework of economic activities and social and community activities, initiatives, some of which are created by international organizations and NGOs to stimulate livelihoods activities, but many of which emerge um, bottom up from the initiative of refugee communities, drawing upon, for instance, remittances, savings, income from so-called incentive work with NGOs and international organizations to create businesses, albeit usually on a very small scale. And that, in a way, is what we wanted to understand to try to look for sustainable alternatives. And so in our research, we ask three core questions, all of which are crucial for sustainability, for ensuring that around the world we can support refugees' access to rights, that we can do so in a way that is politically sustainable for the host country and the wider community, and can potentially endure over time and be applied at scale. Firstly, we ask about welfare. When do refugees thrive rather than merely survive? What explains variation in socioeconomic outcomes? Secondly, we ask about social cohesion. When do refugees and host communities get along? And that's the real advantage of our data focusing both on the refugee communities and the proximate host communities. We can get a sense of the economic lives of both communities, the ways they interact, and the effects of those interactions on mutual perceptions, for instance. And thirdly, we ask about migration and mobility. When do refugees stay or go? When do they select to remain in camps or move to cities or vice versa? When do they move to other secondary cities across the same country? When do they select to cross an international border within their region? Or when do they select to move internationally? And the overall survey, based on representative sampling within each of the communities we look at, is a respondent sample of 16,000 plus refugees and host community members. And for Kenya, at least so far, we've done a second wave of data collection to make that panel data. And what we found, I'll go into depth with some of this, the big picture headline is that a number of development-based interventions seem to be effective across all three of those areas. In particular, education, and we can unpack the particular types of education and what they do in more detail, and the right and opportunity to engage in meaningful work make a massive difference at all three of those levels. So in terms of our sample size, broadly speaking, we've conducted quantitative surveys with 16,710 refugees and members of host communities across those sites. One thing that's been great about our research from a methodological perspective is we've had Somali refugees, the same population, the same nationality of population, present across all sites. Congolese have been present in our Kenyan and Ugandan sites, and we've had other populations, Eritreans and South Sudanese, that we've introduced in just one each of those communities in order to get a degree of control. The methods we've used have been participatory. I think research can always strive to be more inclusive, more participatory, and more based on principles of co-design. But we've really tried to do that within all of our sites, sequencing from in-depth qualitative research, including focus group discussions, towards designing elements of our survey that are specifically designed for context and in a language that fits with the context and the populations. We've also tried to ensure that the audience for our research is not only international organizations, governments, NGOs, even businesses, but also the communities themselves. So this is an illustration of one of our reports on refugee economies in Doloado that we produced in Somali language and held launch events for each of the 5 Doloado camps in southern Ethiopia. So that's an important principle of our work. So let me just touch upon those three main questions I mentioned. Welfare outcomes. One of the concepts that we're developing is the idea of the refugee trap, analogous to the poverty trap in development economics, which is highlighting one of the features of our research being the comparison between refugees and proximate hosts, that refugees seem to be systematically penalized for their refugee status, that systematically across all of our sites, with the possible exception of the Kakuma refugee context in Turkana County in Kenya, refugees appear to be systematically worse off for key welfare indicators than the nearby host communities. And there are many reasons one could hypothesize for that being the case. one of them being the institutional context of having different regulation relating to their socioeconomic rights. One could also hypothesize it being to do with the features of the population, the prior education, the background, their experience of trauma, which may have effects on their economic choices and behavior. But it seems that actually the institutional framework may well play a role in that. But nevertheless, our empirical observation is that, and the stars indicate statistical significance at the 95% confidence level, we see refugees being systematically worse off in income, employment, subjective well-being, food security, health score, and mental health score than the nearby host communities. And that's not because the nearby host communities are disproportionately well off. Relative to national standards, they're often not, but there seems to be this hit that refugees take in terms of welfare outcomes as a result of being refugees. And so the question that then leads us to is look through econometric analysis at what that correlates with controlling for other variables. So for instance, we're able to look at what explains variation in income levels, expenditure levels, subjective well-being, what factors that correlates with for refugees, are they similar to or different from hosts? And here, a range of factors apply, for instance, for income, systematically across the cases, and for the aggregate data set, we see that education matters, that networks seem to matter, including through the proxy of remittances. We see that gender matters, that age matters, that number of years in the camp context or urban context matters. Secondly, social cohesion. One of the really interesting features of our work that builds upon a huge amount of excellent work looking at Europe and North America on what that literature calls native attitudes towards immigrants, host community attitudes towards those who migrate, is we're able to explore the determinants of host community attitudes to refugees and vice versa, and also look particularly at the role of interactions and contact, as the contact theory literature describes it, on those relationships. One of the first things we find is that host community perceptions of refugees tend to be better in the camp contexts than in the urban contexts. One of the reasons for that is in the camp context, the presence of the humanitarian industry appears to be positively perceived as an obvious source of jobs and economic support for the host communities. The second thing we find is that the concerns, insofar as they exist, or the variation that exists in those perceptions, seems to be driven broadly by economic factors rather than security factors or identity factors. Now, that cuts against the grain of some of the findings relating to migration more broadly in Europe and elsewhere, that actually it's culture and identity and the perception of culture that's more likely to drive and explain variation in host community perception. In these contexts, it's the perception of an economic contribution through consumption or being an employee, for instance, that seems to make the difference. And the role of interaction appears to be highly significant in our econometric analysis. There's a correlation between levels of interaction, for instance, through business exchanges, conversations, etc., and positive perception by those communities. Now, we need to control for the direction of causality, and we're doing that through what economists call an instrumental variable approach, but there seems to be a very strong correlation. So economic interactions also seem to matter in our qualitative data. The final area we explore is migration, residency, and mobility. And one of the most robust relationships within the literature on migration and development is the so-called migration hump relationship. That, contrary to a lot of expectation in policymaking, generally when development outcomes such as GDP per capita increase, in the short term at least, the ability and aspiration to emigrate increase up to a certain level, which has been estimated to potentially be around $8,000 per capita. Now, one of the things that hasn't really been explored systematically is whether and to what extent that relationship applies to refugee communities. Much of the empirical data, both at the macroeconomic level and the microeconomic level relating to the migration hump, is for North America and to a lesser extent for Europe. Applying that to the global south and to refugee populations is a different challenge. And it poses a series of questions of, does the relationship hold? What do we mean by development when we disaggregate it? And what does it mean when we disaggregate migration? One of the things that's been very exciting about our panel data is we've gone back to the original populations in our study at a 2-year interval in Kenya, interviewing the same people. And what that's allowed us to do is see who is no longer living in the place where they were 2 years earlier, who has moved onwards, and where have they moved on to, whether within their own community by changing residency, within their own country through internal migration, or through some form of international migration. And the first descriptive finding we've found through that study is that levels of international migration are a very small part of refugee mobility. And migration to Europe has been a tiny part of the observed attrition in that population, around 0.1% per year of the Nairobi population and 0.1% per year of the Kakuma population. Much more significant in international migration has been movement across the border, for instance, from Kenya to Uganda. And even more important has been internal relocation, for instance, including intra-urban or intra-camp. But one of the things we've also started to look at is our data has questions in the survey that allow us to look differently at awareness of migration, aspiration to migrate, and actual migration, whether internationally, nationally, or within the same urban area or camp. And we've been finding things that challenge the presumed migration hump relationships application to the refugee context. For example, we found some initial provisional evidence that higher assets may correlate with a reduced aspiration to engage in international migration and reduced actual international migration. So there's some grounds to believe that actually making people better off across a whole series of development indicators in a refugee context may actually lead to a reduced demand for emigration. More research is needed on that, but it challenges some of those ideas and findings. The final area I want to touch upon is beyond the survey data, we've also tried to look at a series of impact evaluation methods, some of which have a whole series of methodological challenges attached to them. But to tell us, observing some of the contexts of government regulation or particular types of intervention, what seems to work in relation to those three sets of sustainability indicators I looked at. We look, for instance, at Uganda's self-reliance model. Now, Uganda is obviously fascinating because virtually since independence, it's provided refugees with the right to work and freedom of movement, in contrast to neighboring countries. And that offers an opportunity to say, well, what difference does that make to refugees in the host community? The newspaper article you see in the slide that says triumph for Uganda's refugee policy, always will soon be self-supporting, could be a headline from today, but it's actually from the 1960s. This has been an ongoing policy by Uganda and one supported for a long time by the international community. What we tried to do was compare our data for refugees in Uganda with that for refugees in Kenya. Now, there are lots of areas where that comparison across countries breaks down. But what we've tried to do is control for the differences insofar as we can across those countries, look at outcomes for the same populations, Somalis and Congolese, and we found that the Ugandan model, the right to work and freedom of movement, is associated with higher incomes for refugees than those in Kenya, controlling for other variables, lower transaction costs for economic activity compared to in Kenya, and more sustainable sources of employment, by which I mean they're more likely to be employed by other refugees building their own businesses than, for instance, NGOs or international organizations, for example. So the lesson from the Ugandan model, albeit with some caveats, is that although that model has some weaknesses, the right to work and freedom of movement seem to matter and make a difference to refugees. And there's some evidence it also makes a difference to the host community's economy. We've also done a series of impact evaluations on the Kalabaye settlement in the Turkana County region of Kenya. Kalabaye is interesting because it's adjacent to the 4 Kakuma refugee camps I mentioned, but it's been developed since 2016 as an alternative model. It's a settlement model that was designed to be an integrated settlement for both refugees and the host community to live alongside one another. Rather than having a pure in-kind aid model, it shifted to market-based approaches, including cash-based assistance. And instead of just support coming from international organizations, the local government was engaged more in service provision and more active and playing a role in the model. And we've done specific impact evaluations on cash-based assistance, for instance, which has been rolled out for Kalabeye, but to a lesser extent in the Kakuma camps, but also to assess the differences between the Kakuma and Kalabeye models as what economists call a natural experiment, based on recognizing that new arrivals, particularly from South Sudan post 2016, have been quasi-randomly allocated between the old camps in Kakuma and the new settlement in Kalabeye. And the headline figures that come from that are, even though it's been conceived as a self-reliant settlement, it's faced major challenges. There's very little examples of income generating activity or indeed independence from aid in Kalabeye. But what we do see is some evidence that suggests cash-based assistance, albeit with some caveats, increases choice, increases welfare, and has some positive outcomes. We've also done an impact evaluation on a series of private sector interventions in the Doloado camps, 5 camps designed over the last 10 years in the south of Ethiopia for Somali refugees. The Doloado camps are interesting because they've received the largest ever private sector investment in a refugee hosting region from the IKEA Foundation. They've built infrastructure, for instance, irrigation canals to support agriculture in a region where it was extremely difficult to do agriculture. They built a cooperative model where in areas like energy and the environment, agriculture and livestock, they built cooperatives that integrate refugees and the host community. We've been able to identify that although there's variation in the outcomes across those cooperatives, many of them have increased a whole series of socioeconomic well-being indicators for the host community and refugees, and improve relationships between those communities. But it highlights challenges of what it is to build borderland economies in those regions in sustainable ways. Out of our work in these impact evaluations, we've tried to build a model of how do you think about sustainable economies for refugees. And we've extrapolated from that 5 basic conditions that need to be in place to build economies successfully for refugees and hosts in those border economies. Political will, infrastructure, including electricity, water and roads, a comparative advantage that has to be identified for that economy to be able to not just circulate aid, but export to the regional, national, and even international economy. Sociocultural applicability. Some of the examples that have been most successful, for instance, in Doloado and Kakuma, have been those that are adapted to things that people are already doing, such as recognizing that many people in Doloado are nomadic pastoralists, both the Somali refugees and the host community, hence the success of the livestock interventions. And external inputs, not just assistance, but also philanthropy and particularly business. It's been very hard to generate serious investment from the private sector into these types of areas. So I know I've gone through that quite quickly, just to give you a flavor for what our research has tried to achieve. Just let me offer 5 brief conclusions. Firstly, this is in a way a call for an evidence-based approach to refugees and development. And that evidence needs to expand from not just the rich world, to include not just the rich world, but also include low and middle income countries. Too often, policies are driven more by intuition or practice or by politics than by what the evidence tells us. Our work tries to go some way in that direction, but it needs a lot more work in this area. Secondly, and quite self-evidently, urban and rural contexts are different. They offer different sets of advantages to refugee populations. The presence of refugees offers different sets of opportunities to urban hosts and rural hosts. Even though we are in an era of urbanization, in Africa at least, refugee communities are predominantly rural in settlements or camps, and we need to continue to recognize that and opportunities in areas like agriculture. The third big finding of our work is, even though the narrative today is all about self-reliance in policy circles, there are major practical challenges to actually achieving self-reliance for refugees. Across all of our populations, very few of our population actually reach the threshold of being able to independently support themselves without aid. Maybe the threshold set by the UN definition of self-reliance is too high. Maybe it needs to be reconceived, but it's just not working as an approach. We need to reconceive what's realistic, what the goals are, and look at this more in terms of building economies at a local level for hosts and refugees. A lot of the interventions are also highly microeconomic. We need macroeconomic approaches to think about what it is to build economies. That's obviously very different in a city and an urban context compared to these remote borderlands in arid, underinvested in areas with limited infrastructure. And finally, the other element I haven't touched upon that's extremely important is that this isn't just a question of economics or policy, it's also a question of politics. The choices we make politically, both in the rich world and in low and middle income countries, shape economic opportunity, particularly the politics of the right to work. The three countries I've approached have very different practices on the right to work. Uganda offers the right to work. Kenya formally denies the right to work but tolerates it to a certain extent. Ethiopia has for a long time denied refugees the right to work, but recently passed legislation suggesting it may introduce it, but has yet to do so in practice. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander Betts, for your insights. I'm excited to have you in the panel discussion in a few minutes as well. So see you later.